So I was working on this question around how we can build more responsive, kind of more just and responsive internet infrastructure. So not just like thinking about the ways that we manage the data, but how we actually build the actual physical infrastructure. And one of the things that evolved out of the project was really looking at a very specific part of that, which is around Internet of Things and kind of digital connectivity, and trying to understand how we can actually build the infrastructure to support what's happening in the physical world. And I'll give a little bit of background about kind of why this matters. One of the things I've noticed is happening in my work, which has largely been around kind of mobility technology and how we think about kind of movement in urban environments, is that the physical world and the kind of things we're building on the physical devices are increasingly depending on kind of digital infrastructures that are and starting to shift some of the things we've seen in the digital world, like around platform technologies and platform power and surveillance and extractionary business practices. Those are now becoming part of the kind of physical environment as a result of these devices, depending on that sort of infrastructure to operate. And I go into a little bit more about kind of what that is, turning out to be, the opportunities around that are going to look like. But what's happening right now is companies that are moving into the space that need this sort of infrastructure are just absorbing these sort of practices kind of whole cloth. There are two examples of some things that happened during my fellowship that really kind of got me thinking about this as kind of a place to focus. One of these is in the kind of e-bike space, which is where I've worked professionally for the last several years, is thinking about mobility technology. During the fellowship, one of the big kind of like marquee e-bike, connected e-bike companies, a company called Van Move, which is based in the Netherlands, um, went bankrupt. And this was a company that had been celebrated as kind of advancing this whole idea of connected mobility and connected technology. The company went bankrupt kind of suddenly. They had obviously been having some trouble for a while, but they just shut down and announced their bankruptcy. And when that happened, everyone who owned these bikes, and they'd sold hundreds of thousands of them, realized that there was probably no way that they'd be able to continue to use the bikes or any of the kind of digital infrastructure that the bikes depended on if the company went away. And their multi-thousand-dollar bikes were now kind of useless. They also realized that there was a whole set of things around how the bikes were made and manufactured and repaired that was all proprietary and kind of depended on this infrastructure. And there's really no way that they could do this on their own. And that related to huge kind of public conversation about the kind of dependencies of this technology, and also a discussion about kind of what it means to build physically digital devices that are kind of embedded inside of these physical objects, and how we can really reconsider that. The other thing that happened, and this is the thing that kind of has become the core of my work, is that Amazon announced a network earlier this spring that covers 90% of the US population in the US and is built off of the back of IoT devices that Amazon sold to its customers, and then leveraged the home internet connections of all their customers to build this network. Largely kind of without even realizing they were doing it. There was some media coverage of it, but I've talked to a lot of people in the IoT space and wireless space who actually follow the industry really quite closely, and many of them were unaware that this network existed or how it worked. But they managed to kind of sneak this out there in a way that that has become really impactful. It's actually really quite an amazing technical accomplishment, but it's also a really, really big shift in the way we think about public infrastructure. This uses open spectrum, things that are licensed for the public to use, but is run by a kind of maybe one of the worst kind of examples of a platform technology company, and it's been built in a way that's it's fairly aggressive, and it's how it's uh, placed itself in the world. So those two things happened and kind of led me to realize that I wanted to focus on this idea about how we can think about protocols and platforms and the kind of interplay between those in physical world. So what I've been doing as part of my fellowship since like late spring or in early summer is looking at how we can build a protocol-driven approach to IoT. And this is resulted in a project called Hydrogen Plumbing, and I'll explain why that name happened in a second. But it's an IoT stack for kind of connectivity for small, like low power devices, and really thinking about mobility technology as the primary application. And what I did to kind of bootstrap this and kind of initially prototype it is I built it on the kind of repurposed hardware from the failed helium network, which is kind of where the name Hydrogen Plumbing came from. And this is a VC-backed kind of blockchain IoT startup. Just all the buzzwords kind of got mashed together, and they spent $500 million kind of building this network that was supposed to revolutionize the way we do IoT connectivity. And they spent that $500 million, and then a bunch of their customers' money got spent buying these devices that were supposedly part of it, and it didn't work. Like no one used it, and it was really quite kind of a complete failure. So what I ended up doing was getting these devices, and you can now buy these like what were $400 devices that people bought in their home to build these little gateways for this IoT network. And I bought them and then repurposed them and turned them into what are now like kind of an open source stack that goes on top of these, what I've been calling the hydrogen plumbing network, which is using the hardware that's inside them and repurposing them to kind of build a prototype of this gateway. And alongside that, I released a protocol document that kind of talks about how this works and the kind of way that you could build this yourself on your own hardware or on your own terms, and kind of adopting a lot of the kind of core internet protocol approaches to how IoT could work, rather than kind of thinking about this as a venture-backed kind of platform technology. So I released this earlier this fall, and I've been sort of talking about it publicly in the last few weeks, is kind of getting more folks involved in it. But the idea is that this stack could then be implemented in other environments. The gateway kind of device I used with the Helium is just like one starting point for it that could be deployed to other places. So one of the big things that came out of the fellowship for me was really one of the big learnings was really there's a need for a new way of thinking about how we build technology. I think that one of the things I've seen kind of coming into the fellowship, and it's become really more clear to me over the last year, is that there's a lot of frustration in the tech industry right now about how these sorts of things work, and how the business models they kind of drive the technology work. And I think people who have been inside of many of these companies, especially who've kind of been through the kind of ringer as these companies have tried these, really grandiose, highly funded things and then failed. People, I think there's kind of growing dissatisfaction even among the kind of workforce within the industry. And the companies that I think are doing this, except for like even the big companies, there's really, it's not working well for them either. So there's kind of an opportunity right now to really think about new ways of doing this sort of working. And one of the big realizations I had is that infrastructure projects like this, which are kind of like, really focused on building, kind of a public good or kind of a infrastructure that more people can use on their own terms, are really an opportunity not only to build something useful, but opportunity to kind of have a conversation with people and kind of reshape that sort of discourse, because it kind of creates a point of conversation as well as a useful thing. One of the big things that changed for me, I think this is really a pretty substantial shift over the course of the fellowship, was that I was originally thinking about this more in terms of cloud infrastructure and kind of how I used cloud work in my data kind of processing work I've done the last several years in mobility technology. And the cloud infrastructure stuff, I think, is actually really, probably one of the places where there's most concern right now around how kind of platform technologies are evolving. Companies like Amazon and Google, kind of usurping huge chunks of the internet, have created a lot of concern, rightfully. But it's also just an incredibly vast and really capital intensive place to start that work. And what I kind of realized as part of the fellowship is there's lots and lots of, kind of niches within the kind of digital infrastructure world that allow opportunities, kind of small, tractable, kind of like engagement that you can actually think about making, contribution there that's actually kind of wholly contained and useful on its own terms, and kind of can use that to kind of bootstrap larger conversations around how the broader internet infrastructure works. And so I, kind of zeroed in as part of the fellowship on this IoT problem and wireless connectivity, because I saw that as a place that I needed in my work around mobility, but also it was a very practical place to kind of engage with this. It also, in this case, it also is really interesting in terms of how it aligned with the kind of goals of the fellowship and my own kind of personal goals, is that, it also really nicely ties together this question about digital justice and kind of how we think about data and kind of like personal level, because it's dealing with devices that we personally are interacting with as human beings, and kind of makes that a very tangible kind of conversation about how we think about the implications of this from a digital justice perspective. And in the case of mobility technology, it also has quite a bit of big impact in terms of how we think about environmental sustainability. I'm also hoping that, as this goes on, I can use that to kind of continue the conversation about the kind of cloud infrastructure, because a lot of what happens next with the data these sort of devices generate depends on that infrastructure. So I'm hoping to kind of build back towards that more generalized kind of infrastructure as the work continues. So moving forward, I publicly launched the kind of hydrogen protocol project this week. I actually had a really neat opportunity to attend a conference here that just happened to be based where I live in Raleigh, called All Things Open. It's kind of an open source kind of infrastructure conference, really. It's about people who run the kind of plumbing for a lot of kind of corporate kind of infrastructure that are kind of building on open source. And the reason that is here where I live is that Red Hat is actually headquartered here. There's a lot of people that work on those sort of things. There's also a really large kind of network infrastructure technology community here where I live. And so this conference kind of grew up around those. And I got invited to participate in a little demo night that they did at the conference specifically for IoT. There's a little cohort of people here in the Triangle who I was working with over the summer as part of this project who work on IoT hardware. And so I got to show off some of the things I was doing there. Going forward, I think one of the things I'm really trying to figure out how to do right now, and this actually was a great place to begin those sort of conversations, is how to build a collaborator network of people who are interested in this from a technology standpoint, as well as from a kind of application side. And there's some really neat people I met actually at the open source conference that were work on exactly the kinds of hardware and kind of protocol, stuff. And there's some of them have spent their careers kind of thinking about these problems from internet side, that I can kind of continue to build relationships with, and I'm really excited about that. The other thing I'm doing right now is also thinking about how to kind of fund the open source kind of nature of this, because I want to do this as like kind of a fully open product, not just a project, not just as a commercial product. And so I applied for some grant money and things like that may fund some of that kind of protocol development. And I'm also looking at doing some like hardware, like open hardware device sales. We actually have to make devices for people. And part of that's really important in IoT because you have to get regulatory certification for radio devices. So I'm thinking that maybe you can use some of that hardware sales of the open hardware to like then continue that development and get folks involved. But here's a little picture from the conference. This is the little demo night that I attended. Someone else took this picture, but I'm actually over here in the little corner. I actually brought one of the bikes I've been using for demos. You can't really see it. I'm standing in front of it, but had a little demo table with the hardware that I was building and got to talk to really quite a few people at this event. It was really fun. So that was a great kind of like transition for me in terms of going from being one-on-one conversations to more of a public conversation with the industry. So that's kind of where things are right now. And I'm happy to talk more about that later in questions.